So today our topic is going to be looking at the politics of slavery in the late 1840s and 1850s as the Civil War approaches. I'm sure we are all very well aware that the Civil War begins in 1861, but the years leading up to the Civil War beginning is obviously fraught with a lot of the debates that we've already looked at over the course of the last couple of weeks, right? So we've talked about the Mexican-American War and how that is an expansion of American territory, and when that happens, obviously, there's the major question about what's going to happen with slavery when we arrive at that further point. We also know that in 1820 there had been the Missouri Compromise that had also settled a debate over slavery in the Louisiana territory. We know that um, every time a state gets admitted, that question of slavery is something that's sort of in the back of the minds of everybody, or maybe not even in the back of the minds, maybe really predominant. So today we're going to be looking at the politics that go into that in the 1850s and really in many ways create all of the problems that are going to precipitate the Civil War in the 1860s. So we're going to be looking at what I'm titling here, Freedom and Slavery. So just a little bit about cotton and slavery in the South, right? So we know that cotton is really the dominant industry in the Americas, right? So, or North America, right, in the United States, right? We know that, or I hope you know that sugar is really the dominant one in the Caribbean. So in the Caribbean, you have predominant sugar in places like Haiti. You have sugar in um, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Brazil, certainly. But cotton is really the dominant one in the 1800s in the United States. And why is that, right? The idea here is that in the industrial society, the textile industry is really the dominant industry. And because of that, uh, a lot of people obviously want clothing, and everybody needs clothing, so that becomes a huge commodity for these Southerners. And as a result of that, you have the growth of a demand for slavery. As the price of cotton goes down because it's cheaper and you can be more efficient in producing it, one of the things that happens is you have a significant amount of demand increase because, well, in order to keep profits coming in, you need to produce more cotton. In order to produce more cotton, you need more workers. In order to need more workers, slaves are obviously the workers. There's also another interesting thing that happens here, right? Because the South is an agricultural society, and it does have a major port, two major ports, right? New Orleans in the Caribbean, but obviously Charleston in South Carolina. The other problem really is that the major ports for shipping are in the north, right? Boston and in particular New York are the dominant ports. So because of that, you have this interesting situation where southern cotton is finding its home, or at least its shipping home, in New York shipping. So the cotton is going north to New York and then across the Atlantic to Britain, where they're producing textiles. So you have that interestingly happening. In the South, there's a growing aristocracy that is happening here. There's about 1,700 families that are the dominant cotton families. They own multiple plantations and hundreds of slaves. Whenever we think about Southern plantation living, we often think about those slave families with their many slaves. But the reality was most Southerners did not have that many slaves. Or if they owned a slave, they may own a slave or two, maybe a family of slaves, but they by no means had large plantations. Most Southerners really saw slaves as sort of their quote unquote American dream, or in many ways they saw it. They fought for slavery so fervently because they believed that this was sort of, if they could gain a slave, they could then, or earn a slave, or however you want to think of it, buy a slave, they would then sort of make their way in the world. And that's what these different slides that I'm going to post will say. I want to jump, though, really up to here. I want to start talking then about what's the major things that happen to bring about the major problems of the 1850s and 60s. So 1820, we have the Missouri Compromise, brings in Missouri and Maine as two states, one free, one slave. Sets a line that the southern border of Missouri can't have you can't have slavery above it. 1850 comes around, and we basically we strip the Missouri Compromise away. Now, they bring Henry Clay out of retirement, the great American compromiser, right? The guy who brings around all these compromises. This is often called the compromise without compromises, right? Basically, what Clay says is everybody wants these different things. We're going to give them to each other. He comes up with 8 points, and we're all going to agree to these. This is what everyone wants. This is what you're going to get. You're going to agree to it because you want these. You want, and everybody, it works out, right? John C. Calhoun is dying of tuberculosis, and he comes out to disagree with Clay's proposal. This is a proposal that people vehemently despise. However, at the end of the day, there's 4 pieces to it, right? The Northerners really want California to come into the states as a free state. If California can come in, then we can get, a large state. But the Southerners hate this, right? Because California is a huge piece of territory. So what they demand is number 4, the Fugitive Slave Law. And we'll look at that in a few moments. The Northerners get slave trade being forbidden in the District of Columbia, although slavery is still allowed. And New Mexico, and Utah can decide how they want to be, whether free or slave, and ultimately both become free states. So the Fugitive Slave Law is a law that Northerners really hate, right? If anybody here has seen the movie 12 Years a Slave, or read the book, or know anything about Solomon Northup, right, that this is sort of what that is, right? So the Fugitive Slave Law, I have numbers here, and not terribly important, but what is important to know is that if a slave runs away, the slaveholder from the South is able to reclaim that slave by basically sending bounty hunters to find that slave. Now, and then in order to sweeten the pot, magistrates, judges basically get paid $10 for returning a slave, $5 for not returning a slave. So, I mean, it's a huge, it's obviously a moneymaker for the South. It's obvious, but what this really does is this also means that any African American who was free basically could be thrown into slavery, and obviously that's the case of Solomon Northup. So this is a huge problem, and it's something that this is something that people in the North and the South, well, the North in particular, really hate. The Southerners obviously are like it a bit more because for those who lose their slaves, they can sort of get to reclaim them. The next major thing that happens here is the Kansas-Nebraska territory problem, right? So Kansas and Nebraska are both places in the that want to become American states. They have the sort of required number of people to enter into the Union. And because, again, we're in a period where the United States wants to continue expanding westward, people want Kansas and Nebraska to enter in. Again, the slavery issue rears its ugly head, right? And the question now becomes, are Kansas and Nebraska going to enter into the Union as slave states or free states? The decision ultimately comes that they're going to do popular sovereignty, meaning the people who live there vote, and they vote to either make it slave or free. in order to try and sway on one side or the other, pro-slavery and anti-slavery people begin to basically flood the territory in order to vote in one direction or the other. The only problem is for the Northerners trying to gain this much support, I should say the anti-slavery people to gain that much support and send people to the territory, doesn't really happen. But pro-slavery folk flood the territory, and or at least in the case in Kansas. And the other piece to this, I mean, there's a lot of problems here, right? I mean, we've already basically made the Missouri Compromise null, and then with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, they officially violate it. They officially sort of repudiate it. You send also a militia of a couple of thousand Missourians, flood Kansas, and they are very well armed, and they're prepared to start, slaughtering people to defend slavery. Finally, the last big thing here is the Dred Scott decision. Now, James Buchanan, who had been elected the 15th president in 1856, he takes office in 1857, and by pretty much all accounts, Buchanan is the worst president the United States has ever had, because if there was ever a thing that he could do to try and stop the beginning of the Civil War, he did the exact opposite. He did pretty much everything in his power to precipitate the Civil War, and one of the such event is the Dred Scott decision. So in 1857, Dred Scott, a slave from the South, who had moved with his owner Stanford throughout the country. Right, he had lived in Illinois, he had lived in the Wisconsin Territory, he had lived in free states for a good number of years, 5 or so years, and he sued for his freedom. Now, different courts had heard the case. It flip-flops back and forth, ultimately winds its way up to the Supreme Court. Now, James Buchanan actually sort of prods the Southern Democrat Supreme Court to side with Stanford, right, against Scott. So basically Roger B. Taney, the Chief Justice of the court, his decision is very partisan. He basically says that African Americans, slaves, can never be citizens of the United States because they were not citizens in 1787 when the country was founded, and this country could not have black citizens. Slaves are also property, and because they were property, they could be moved to wherever. And it doesn't matter, if they moved into a place where slavery was illegal, they were still property. And finally, the last big thing is it makes if we just want to keep pushing away the Missouri Compromise, right? It says the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional because it can't ban slavery in places. It's a local decision. So basically what it says here is slavery is a national thing. Any place can have slavery, but freedom is something that has to be sort of decided on locally. So it's this really interesting case where the Supreme Court, this group that's supposed to at least seem impartial, is certainly tipping the scales in one direction. Anyway, what I'm trying to show you here is that the 1850s are a period where slavery seemed to be the perennial, the everyday topic, right? And there were a few moments where slavery and the Civil War could be sort of dissipated, but everything that was happening was attempting to upend that.